All right. Okay, there we go. All right, so does anyone want to kind of summarize the case a little bit or maybe share their thoughts on it?
Summarize how they are stupid.
Go ahead.
There's my summary. Selfishness, stupidity. There you go.
Yeah, that was. I mean, as I was reading this case, I was surprised that such a prestigious agency, such a crappy leadership. At least back then, I don't know now, but I was very surprised. So I held them in such a high standards.
Well, this actually proves to me why NASA doesn't do flights anymore. Well, but I remembered in the news. So I think this is one of the reasons why we don't do what we did before, like is because of these kinds of things. But what really struck me was the lack of strong communication in that agency. I guess it's the fact that there were just too many hands in the candy jar type of thing. There's just too many people. But but that's what I got from it.
Yep.
Yeah,
so go ahead, Carlos.
Oh no, continue.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, with the case, what do you guys think are some of the key issues that sort of led to this disaster, really?
I think they cut a lot of corners because of the tight budget that they had for everything. And they said, what did they say? I don't remember the exact number of flights they said they would put up, but they're trying to hit this number that they said they would do and they got all the funding for. And so they cut the corners and they were okay with that and said, prove something's wrong before we fix it or try to fix it. So that was a big problem.
Yep.
I think so too. I mean, there was problems. They kept doing the same things. I feel like they just had their end goal in mind, but they didn't think about the small goals that would lead them to the end goal. And by doing that, they really hurt people and affected tons of people in a negative way.
Yeah.
And I also noticed that they were aware of some issues, like technical issues that kept happening, but they didn't do anything to address them or fix them.
Mm-hmm.
And
their image.
Yeah, so I was like, I mean, you were like, this is happening constantly, or it's not the first time that happened. So why are you just letting this slide, like not even doing anything about it?
Yep.
Well, my question about that is, they have that kind of safety department within them that's supposed to be the one that's helping make sure that this is safe and secure. But then it doesn't seem like they're even using that agency, or that the agency has enough power to say, hey, wait, and the fact that, like Britton said, that they're like, prove to me that there's something wrong. Well, there was something wrong, but they were still kind of brushing it off. Like, I don't understand the mentality and all of that, where you have these things in place, but then you're not using them, and then you keep on having issues.
Yep, for sure.
I don't know, maybe somebody could explain that better for me, because it was just so confusing.
Mm-hmm. I think it was kind of just with that specific issue of the debris strike, because it had happened so many times. There was kind of this bias of oh, that's not a key issue. And I think it mentioned somewhere when some representative of the, what's it called? The DAT, I think that was the group that was specifically focusing on the foam issue thing, had gone up to someone above them and was kind of trying to push it. And they were like, we have more pressing issues. There are other things happening in this flight that pose a more dangerous threat than that does. And that's the one that ended up, causing it to explode, basically. And so that's interesting. I think that their priorities just clearly weren't in line. They were still doing stuff and looking into things, but they weren't treating every single threat as a potential disaster like they probably should have been.
Well, and if you look at one of the guy's attitude was, I forgot who said it, but he said if this is really what the big problem is, then it's too late. We can't do anything. And they kind of had the mentality of they're on their own schedule and they kind of all had their own time frame of what they thought was right and what they could do. Because one guy who was pressing to get those images and work with the military to try to get more images, people didn't care about it. The top guys, he took 5 days just to even look into it and do things. But if you also go back, this has happened before with the O-rings on the prior shuttle. So they've known these problems, and instead of solving them and realizing that this could put the astronauts' lives in jeopardy, they continue to just say, hey, we've had successful missions with this, so let's just keep moving forward. They were lucky, and I think they knew they were lucky, and they kept pressing it because of like what Britton said with the budget cuts and timing, and they had to get I think 50 launches off in the year and all that stuff. So yeah, they cut corners and just figured they'd continue to be lucky, which that only lasts so long.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So what do you guys think are some of the human cognitive biases that are present in this case? It kind of says, just systematic errors in judgment, some biases, and then sort of what evidence kind of proves that those biases were in place.
I think they don't really, I don't know if this answers the question, but you tell me. I think that they didn't really have a clear line of leadership where you report to this person and where people actually listened. And if it was a real big deal, they would bring it up to the next level. So I think the leadership was lacking a little bit. So they might need to work on that.
Yeah, it seemed like everybody, the leader kind of each section kind of just did their own thing, and there wasn't somebody over them, which was supposedly, I forget the tier on the graph, but the guy in Washington is supposed to be the main guy. Was it Sean O'Keefe? He's the NASA administrator, so he's a top dog. So you'd think that they'd be reporting something to him and he'd be making final decisions, in my opinion. But it seemed like everybody had their own decisions that they were making that was messing up other departments, and there was no one person kind of in control.
I think too, another bias that I would say that they had was that they each had their own titles, and so they felt like if I'm the engineer that did this, then I know everything about this, so nobody could question me or something like that. And I think that's another reason that people were just kind of brushing things off, because whoever was in charge of the foam, they said, oh, it's good. And so the people, like, I think it was Linda Ham that said, oh, there's nothing we can do about that anymore because it is what it is. And so I feel like those people that were in the decision-making responsibility or position, they were just going to that one person. And if that person says yes, okay, we'll go ahead. Like they didn't open up their minds to what the other engineers were thinking or were suggesting.
Yeah, I know something it mentioned also was that in NASA at the time, it wasn't really appropriate to report anything to anyone other than like the next person up on, the rung of the ladder. You couldn't really go like above their head. That was sort of just not the culture or whatever. So it was sort of, all you could do was tell it to your boss, and then, they would kind of decide if it was important enough to go to their boss and just sort of, up the line. And with the biases, one thing that I kind of like thought and compared it to was like, it had happened like 6 or 7 previous times, this foam strike, and nothing bad had happened. And so because it happened so many times, they were like, oh, well, it's not, we don't really consider it a threat anymore. The first time it happened, I think they investigated it and they had labeled it as some kind of threat. And then that threat level kind of went down every single time that it happened. And there was nothing bad happened from it. And so I kind of think of it like, you know, when you like rent a car or like rent a moving truck or something, there's always the option to like purchase the insurance on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, if nothing bad ever happens, you're like, oh, well, I've never been in an accident. I've rented cars a bunch of times. I've rented trucks a bunch of times and nothing bad's ever happened. So, you know, I don't need to get it this time. And, you know, that's the time that you end up getting into an accident. And it's like, because for some reason in our brains, we think that the probability of an accident is like less just because it's never happened, even though like the probability is pretty much the same every single time you get into a car, really. But just because, you know, the longer it goes with nothing bad happening, we somehow tend to think that it's just not an issue anymore. So that's kind of what I thought about that.
Yeah,
Well, and to add to that, the sad part to that is that because of their probability, their expectations going low, that their standards have gotten low. Like they had totally changed their standards to make it low. And that's the sad part, is like what you were saying, Sorrel, it's like your probability has gotten low, but still the standard shouldn't have changed, but they changed it. I think that's part of that.
But the thing is too, so my husband works like safety, and you know, there's these precautions, and most people are like, oh, it never happens, and then something very tragic happens. But sometimes when it tragically happens, they'll change some things, but they don't change, like there's like, oh, well, it's just, you know, a once in a while thing, where you would think, especially if someone lost their life, that you would, it's a wake-up call. But in life, you know, things happen to us and we're either like, that, no matter if it's, you know, the way we talk to someone or whatever the case may be, or we're like, okay, I'm not gonna ever do that again. You know, I think that happens to us a lot with any situation on how we deal with things. Either it changes us to be better, or we're just like, okay.
Mm-hmm. That kind of leads into the next question. So why and when and how did the debris strike become an acceptable risk?
Well, I mean, the debris strike has happened for, I don't remember, I mean, how many years and how many launches? I mean, it's essentially happened in what, 80% of the launches or something it said? Like,
yeah, it had basically been going on for the past 20 years and it happened pretty much every time.
So for me, it became acceptable the first time it happened. They didn't fix it because they kept launching. And they also knew that when they launched, it was most likely going to happen. So the question just became, how much damage is going to be done every time it happens? And to date, it was acceptable damage. But, you know, to me, when I think of NASA, I think of, you know, when they have a problem like that, they don't, you know, they would fix it immediately without question. So to, you know, same thing kind of with the O-rings problem. For them to cut corners like that on something, I mean, so important, you know, especially when you have a guy saying it's supposed to be low temperatures and these O-rings won't function in low temperatures. And when it comes to launch time, they know the degrees is 36 degrees and they still launch. I mean, it's just people who have their own agendas who don't care, you know, for the safety of those astronauts, and they got to push that agenda, you know, whether it's budget or scheduling or whatever, and it just makes it wrong.
Yeah. Like they're determined, it doesn't matter who's in their path, they're going to get to their end result. And if destruction happens, oh, well, it's not me.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Just sad because this program could have been, you know, pretty cool if they were able to keep it up, you know, like they could have more, I think, out of these launches close together, you know, instead of do it real fast. But I think it's like competition between, you know, who's the best, who can do it first, comparing ourselves, you know, we're best, our countries compare, or we compare ourselves with other people. So it's not about the journey, it's about how fast you can get there. Box.
Well, this is a great example of what Covey was saying in his book about synergy and how, like, if we were to compromise, it's just 1 + 1 = 1.5. But if we had synergy, it's 1 + 1 = maybe 8, 16, or 1600. And so I think this is like a great example of like when people are so just individualistic, when they come into a group setting, a team setting like this, and they have their own, they each have their own agendas. But if they come in and synergize, actually like think about what would be best for the whole group rather than what would be best for me, then I think that they wouldn't have this issue because they'd be more open-minded and less about like, you know, what it is, what's in it for me, or how can I move forward without thinking of how this is going to affect everybody else.
Let's see. So another question just on the agenda, it talks about the recovery window. So that just means the time period between a threat and an accident, or, you know, if a prevented accident, basically just that time window. And so the question is, you know, what was the recovery window in this case? And sort of along with that, could anything, you know, really have been done in that recovery window, or was it already kind of a lost cause from the beginning?
Well, I think they had 16 days because, I mean, the thing was, the whole flight was 16 days. So if they already knew from the first day from the launch that there was something wrong, I mean, they could have, I mean, they did have the DAT to try to figure it out. But I just feel like they were just brushing everything off. And it wasn't like a, you know, they weren't working 24/7 to find a solution. And I think that was the sad part, is I would consider that 16 days a recovery period, but they didn't do anything.
Yeah, I think, you know, their biggest failure, in my opinion, was they didn't get the imaging immediately or at all. Because if they would have seen that damage on day one, they could have then, you know, used that next 15 days or whatever to create, you know, a solution, or if possible, expand the astronauts' time in space until they did. Or, you know, maybe it would have been possible to land them at the space station and have them kind of stay there until they figure something out, or they send up another rocket with repairs, or, you know, something. So I think the key was they didn't figure out what that damage really was and if it was life-threatening. And because if they would have done it on day one, I think they would have had a different scenario, and they could have figured out, you know, other ways to fix the problem and or, you know, keep the astronauts alive. So I think the imaging was key, because without that, everybody was guessing, which is why nothing got done. And everybody was just assuming that it was fine. But without evidence of anything, nobody could make a educated decision on anything.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought when I was reading the case. I felt like they spent the 15 days just to determine whether it was a threat or not, rather than just treating it as a threat, as something serious from the very beginning. They just spent the 15 days deciding if it was serious. But I think, you know, and maybe that's impossible, but for me personally, I'm like, when you're dealing with something that is so dangerous, I feel like they've sort of become numb to how dangerous this really is. Like, every time you send someone up into space, like, there's a huge threat just in that. And so you would think that every tiny little thing that they would treat as a serious issue, and, you know, they didn't. And, you know, it led to this, you know, horrible thing, and people died. And, you know, they just sort of let that go when they really should have spent, as it was already, you know, discussed, they should have spent those 15 days finding a solution and acting as though, like, you know, let's pretend that this is serious, and, like, let's say that it did, you know, hit a major part of the shuttle, and that it's, you know, we can't re-enter the atmosphere. What would we do? Instead, they just spent the whole time just deciding if it was even a problem at all.
Yeah.
I don't remember what. Oh,
no,
sorry,
go ahead.
Okay. Okay, hold on. So I don't remember what movie it was, but there was a movie where this sort of thing happened. Something wrong went on in space, which is like every other movie, right? But in this movie, they had to get like a square. They only had this one plug that is a circle, but they had the thing that you insert that's a square. And they worked so hard. The people on the ground worked so hard to figure that out and to help the astronauts out. And I just I wish it was that sort of situation where they tried to figure out anything they could do, everything they could do to save the lives, because I don't really feel like they even thought of the astronauts in this case. I would have been so frustrated being one of those astronauts and be like, save me. And that, they're not really working to help you repair it or save you. So that would be frustrating. I'm frustrated that happened.
Did it mention in there at all if they were communicating with the astronauts to where they could have gone out and visually inspected the damage, or did they keep that internally and didn't even tell the astronauts? I don't remember.
I think it was discussed, and I know initially they didn't tell him at all. Like, they weren't even going to tell him that there was a debris strike, and then I think a few days in, they did tell them it was a debris strike, but they flat out told them it's not an issue, it's not a threat, but this did happen.
Yeah, see, that's the other thing is I don't understand why they couldn't have asked them, to go out and inspect it, them, see if they could get a visual on it and inspect it. I mean, I don't know what the complications of that are, but I mean, if they're, landing the space shuttle in the space station or on the moon or whatever, and you have people outside the space shuttle, it would have seemed to me that they could have visually looked at the damage and inspected it and communicated that back to the people on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's another thing that I noticed about this reading, that there wasn't like a procedure. There were no procedure guidelines or like a to-do list before before a takeoff or like a landing. If they had those procedures, those guidelines, they would have the astronauts could have would have to check for everything, and see how substantial the damage was,
Mm-hmm.
and see if they could fix it, or maybe, or like you said, extend their stay up in the at the space station, so they wouldn't risk to die, going back to Earth.
I was going to say too, it just seems like the people in the ground wasn't taking this seriously. I mean, we read in a part of there that part of their procedure was that they were to meet within this 16-day goal, or whatever it's called, flight. They were to meet every single day, kind of just to have a meeting and talk about it. But they were not even doing that. They were meeting like every 5 days or so. So it just seems like the people on the ground wasn't taking this seriously.
I don't think there was any connections. Like, when I work with people, I mean, I'm not their best friend, and I don't hang out with them every weekend because I have family, you know what I'm saying? But I still care about them to a degree. Like, how would you, in my little job as a cross-country coach, I cannot imagine doing something to know that my actions could take someone's life. Like, where was their relationships? This was 22 years of this, and they didn't do anything. That's kind of, I'm surprised, I don't know, that someone else didn't step in, like the government or something, and say like, okay, what we're doing. I mean, this is for the whole world too. Like, they are like a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't the reading say that a lot of workers in NASA were discouraged from reporting any sort of irregularity that they saw?
Even if it was, I don't know. I just think it comes to a point in your life, you have morals, and even if it would cost you my job, like, you can get a new job. You can't replace people who are dead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do agree with you. Yeah, so that was I was trying to get to that. Was like, people didn't have any morals. They were like, oh, whatever, it's somebody else's life, not mine.
Mm-hmm.
Oh well, such is life.
Yeah,
That's
I think they were all just a little bit overconfident. They were a little too like, it'll be fine, just brushing it off. I remember something that was surprising when I was reading it was that they didn't even know that it had like exploded until they got a call from someone saying they were watching it on the news. And I was like, they don't have like a camera outside watching it happen. Like they didn't know till somebody called them. That's crazy. Like I remember thinking that was totally nuts that the news caught it before they did. I'm like, okay, clearly they're not like they didn't think anything was wrong at all. They weren't even watching. Like
There was another day in the office.
Well, it says in the reading that they did have cameras, but because of budget cuts, they took off the cameras.
yeah.
So,
They did. They
but
started with good cameras and they took them off.
going back to what Amy was saying, like I think it's the culture of the NASA, because I think I read somewhere where it says that somebody did say that the culture was extremely bureaucratic and hard to navigate. So it's like they knew that the culture itself within the organization was bad, and yet nobody was stepping up to change anything.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know who had to go talk to their families and tell them that they screwed up.
Yeah.
Or even if the families even knew what the truth is.
Yeah, I was wondering if they would even.
Yeah, the government and all that is very good at covering things up and telling you, kind of what you want to hear, not the truth. Because I'd be extremely upset knowing, as a spouse, hey, you guys screwed up. You could have saved my, husband or wife if you would have done your job and you didn't. I understand the risk of them going up, and if casualties happen based off of certain things, you have to accept that. But off of just human stupidity, I have a hard time with that.
Yeah, I was doing some research and I think it said it in the case study too. Basically, like even like one of the main guys, one of the top dogs had said like he was still completely in denial that like the foam strike was really the cause of it. And so it was February 1st, 2003 that the shuttle like exploded, and they didn't kind of come out publicly with everything that happened until August 23rd, 2003. So it was about 6 months later that they brought it public, but they did say they were like, this is exactly what happened. This piece of foam knocked off, hit the.
So they could get a job. They could find new jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if the families of those astronauts sued the NASA or the government, because I would have been like, you know what, guys, I know there's no money that will bring back my spouse or mom, dad, whatever, but you're gonna have to pay for my suffering, because especially since it was your negligence,
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't
I don't know if there's any lawsuits, but I'm sure there was.
Mm-hmm.
But then too, they have to be able to pay out the money, and if they didn't have money, what are they going to pay out?
So just give me one of those sheep.
That's that thing too. It's like you can sue people, but if no one has money, then you're really out of money because you're spending the money for your lawyer.
Yeah.
I would be like, give me one of those ships and park it in my lawn.
There you go. Well, this is my thing though.
NASA's connected to the government, so there's money to be had, especially on a suit like that.
Oh yeah, they'd find it.
Well, then and it reiterates, and that's why the government says no more NASA, because it was just I'm just thinking they just think that the government is looking like it's just a pit. We just put money in there, and it's nothing. It's doing nothing for us.
But I would think too, like going back to your job, you thinking that you made a successful mission by killing people, like, whoa. Like I'd be like, okay, this time we're going to make sure everyone gets back. Then it's successful, like we completed, not like, let's just get them up in the air. That sounds like the easy part, right? Sling someone up in the air.
I think I've heard that before. The mission accomplished. But anyway, because like I said, I remember the accident, but I didn't know the actual causes until I read the article, and I was like, wow. Like to me, like NASA is one of the the best agencies out there, and I held them, like I said, but but I guess people make mistakes, and some people just don't care about their jobs, even in a place like that.
Bro, when you were reading more on it, did people? I'm assuming heads rolled for this, or I mean, what happened to those in leadership on this, or was it just kind of a slap on the wrist? We're shutting NASA down, or did anybody have to face any consequence for this?
Not that I saw. I didn't see anything specifically that said like, oh, these were the people who like got fired and whatnot. Basically, all it really said was sort of they formed this the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, and they published their findings, and there's like multiple volumes. They did a ton of detail, but basically, they summed it up to there was the immediate cause of the accident, which was the foam, and then there was also an organizational cause, a problem within NASA. So they blamed some people, but I don't know if anyone actually like got fired or had to face consequences. And then what they did was sort of they made a bunch of specific recommendations of what NASA needed to do, and then NASA implemented those recommendations. And that was kind of it.
Interesting.
I'm still surprised that they let this go on for 22 years. It's a long time.
Yeah.
To not fix a problem or to stop it before someone else, because I was talking with this, I was in Washington, and I was talking with my brother, my sister, like it happening and it affected them. And I mean, they know no one in NASA, but like when something like that happens, it affects the whole nation, and they don't remember exactly, but it still to this day, they remember hearing about it, and it affected them in a way that was, I'm sure, sad. Not like, oh, yay, they blew up.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know.
Well, I think it shows you, too, just how much they hide things to get their agenda done, because I don't know if the public knew that there was a foam problem. Right? And if they did know, I think that would have been a long time ago of the public saying, fix this before you send more astronauts up in the air. And did the astronauts know? Did they know the risk, knowing that when they were going to launch, that foam was going to fall off and damage the shuttle, and they were just going to have to deal with it? So I just wonder.
It's probably a 1,000-page paper that they had to sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, accepting others. So my next question is, when did the problems with Columbia really begin? And then when did the problems with this like specific mission really begin, and what sort of started that?
I think we've kind of answered that already. Yeah, exactly, from the very beginning. I think that's the consensus. Is from the get-go.
Yeah, I think they just didn't have they just didn't have the right sort of organizational policies in place from the beginning, I think, on that end. And then the fact that they sort of, I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I don't claim to have a solution. Maybe there was no other way than to set up this bipod ramp than with foam that would fall off. But you would think the very first time it fell off, they would go, okay, this isn't going to work. We've got to figure out a different way to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also,
so maybe in 1981, but in 2003, our technology is advanced by 2003.
Yeah. And if the chart on the foam falling off on the specific shuttles, it was the most common on the Columbia. It happened the most on the Columbia. So they knew that ship was going to have problems, because in the past it was the one that had the most problems. Mm-hmm. And they even identified it as the worst ship to get up in the air, but the best ship to fly in space. So I mean, they already knew that there was going to be problems. And then for them to say, hey, we're going to launch, these next 2 missions, even though we know we have these problems. I mean, it was set up to fail at the beginning just because of scheduling and money. And so they didn't do anything to correct anything. They just wanted to push these through and get them up in the air, knowing they knew there was going to be problems. They just were crossing their fingers nothing big would happen.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And when there were problems, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Rocha. he emailed the manager saying, can we ask somebody else to help us, ask an outside agency for assistance? And they completely just kind of ignored that, and they canceled all the requests for that. So that's not good.
Yep.
I think too the issue with them is that they were thinking short term. Like they were talking. Jared was talking about how the Columbia had issues. I remember reading something that they even named it. Was it the hangar space shuttle or something? Because it's like in between every missions, it goes into the hangar to get repaired. And so they were just like kind of patching it up and then, okay, you're good to go again. Instead of like trying to like figure out how can we make this space shuttle better so we don't have to keep on bringing it back to repairs. But they were like, oh, that's long term, that will cost money, that all these things. So they were just very focused on short term results.
And unfortunately, it's just another example of how money rules. It doesn't matter if it's sending astronauts into space or the mechanic fixing your own car. Money is what rules, and it's a sad. It's sad that that's really how everything is money is the ultimate say. If NASA had an unlimited budget, sure, they could have probably done things or repaired things, but choices are made based on money, and people's lives are at stake based on money every day, and that's what's sad. Lives don't come first, money comes first.
Yeah, I think the whole budget issue was like one of the main root causes in this, was because they were really just trying to stay in budget. I remember I was like shocked at how much it cost, like each mission. I was like, okay, it makes sense that the shuttle costs like billions of dollars, but they were like, each time we spend it into this and send it into space, it costs however much it was. It was like in the millions. I was like, oh my gosh, that is insane. Like, that's crazy. And they had to make sacrifices, and it talks about like was mentioned before, they used to have cameras on it, but they had to take them off because it was too expensive and all these things. And it's like, okay, it's okay to operate within a budget, but which things are you going to sacrifice? Are you going to sacrifice safety? Because if you're sacrificing safety, it's probably, not worth it to do it at all, really. Because I think losing your whole space shuttle is going to be a lot more expensive than, those cameras were to put on it or whatever could have prevented it.
Yeah.
So how would you guys categorize or characterize the culture at NASA? What were some strengths and then what were some weaknesses?
I found a lot of weaknesses, not really any strengths.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
Well, strength is determination. Go ahead, Britton.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying, definitely communication was a weakness between the different people.
And also leadership and complacency. They were very
So Amy, strength is their motivation, but ultimately that motivation was that considered a strength? Because it ended up being a weakness of killing people.
Yeah, they're good at killing people.
Yeah,
that's their strength.
Yep.
They're murderers.
They were very individualistic too. I think that's part of the sad culture there.
Yeah, I think everyone was kind of out for themselves a little bit. I think the major weakness was really just in the way it was organized with all these different committees, and I felt like it was very confusing. People were reporting to lots of different people, and things weren't just going anywhere. I know one thing that I noticed was with the I think it was called like the MMT, and that was kind of like the main committee that was really responsible. And they said that that was supposed to be like the main point of contact. They were supposed to know every single thing that was going on. Like everyone was supposed to sort of report to them. And if you do go to them, they should have an answer. And when whoever it was on the DAT or whatever requested that, the imaging for the government, and then 5 days later, they kind of got back the government, or not the government, like the military with their satellite cameras. And they were like, hey, like, did you guys still want that, that imaging? And the person that I went to was like, I didn't request any imaging. They went to the MMT and not a single person there had requested it. And none of them even knew that anybody had requested it or wanted it. And so they were like, nope, it's fine. Like, we don't need it. I didn't request it. You didn't request it. And I'm like, I see this happen at my work all the time on a much, much smaller scale, obviously. But there's sort of this, if you don't have one group or one committee or one person that kind of knows, or one, group that knows everything that's going on. And if you're not sharing with everybody else what you're doing, then things get lost, and someone goes, oh, I thought someone requested this. Oh, well, I didn't hear anything about that. So I guess we don't need it, even though they really did want that. And they were pretty upset, when they found out that the imaging request had just been canceled on them.
Yeah. You think that would have been a red flag? Like, ooh, someone's requesting something? Oh, that's weird. Let's figure out why. And so like, oh, it's just a mistake. Like,
I think they would have asked around a little bit further, like, oh, who requested this? But because they were supposed to be in charge, and they were like, well, I guess it's not that important because we didn't request it and we didn't hear about it. So
seems like the government, though, they always go super slow. Like, nothing's important.
Yeah.
Just like,
My question is, like, how do companies now handle things like this, as far as, like, because there's a lot of companies now that they outsource specific things within their production. And so how do the companies manage to make sure that there is communication and there's like this sort, like, so this doesn't happen in other companies?
I don't think it's communication. I know a lot of people, like in construction, and if you're doing stuff with people, you have OSHA's, like, and there's other people that come and check you. But also, too, it just depends. Because, like, if you're a small company and you don't really are doing much, then they won't. Or sometimes if you're a big company and you do a lot of money and they like you, favoritism, then they bypass things.
Because, like, so my husband is a truck driver. And so he, his dedicated route is he takes GM products to out of state, different states. And so I'm just thinking, so GM, instead of them hiring their own trucking, they outsource it. So if something happens to that product, or, the people that are involved in that, like, who then do they just say it's all the trucking people's fault? Like, how do how do companies deal with other companies, because they're all connected now? But that's kind of just what I'm curious, because that's kind of how the organization structure was for this one, is that they have too many hands in the pot. So how does companies nowadays handle this without having too much risk and liability? Is that the right?
But they have, I think, some things, like, I mean, I'm just using what I know. So when people are subcontractors for a job on a government facility, they have certain things that they have to, because people are looking at them all the time. But if that same subcontractor goes to a residential house or a residential thing where there's not a lot of eyes, then there's no one that checks on them, really. So it just depends, I think, on what the situation. It's not like it's this all the time. It's like, oh, it's this time and this time. There's nothing set. That's what I know. I don't know. Jared might know more because he's in business, but that's what it seems like.
Yeah, but it also depends on if you're talking government versus private. That's different too. Government has way too many organizations and way too much, red tape, and that's why there are a lot of problems in government entities. You look at private, there's always leadership in the private, and there's always a tier, and a well-structured company. You look at Apple, everything starts with the CEO and Tim Cook, and it goes down, and they have organizations that are there to, that are over specific things, but it still starts with Tim Cook. A good company, it always will start and end with that CEO. And they'll have management, they'll have teams in place, for things. And they have, areas that they have to report on and communicate with, and, structure that has to be followed. And And if it's not, they do internal investigations. Private companies are a lot more strict on this than government, because government likes to hide things, whereas private, is very open because of, especially if they're on the stock exchange, they have to be. So, if it was run more, if companies were run, more on a private basis rather than on a government basis, they would be much more successful. And I mean, that's why you look at all the government entities from, the post office to anything else, why they're bankrupt and why they don't make any money and why they fail. UPS, FedEx, it's proven that it can work and make billions of dollars. And so why it's so hard for the government to lead in that way, I don't know. But on a private sector, like even at my work, we have a board in place. Everything reports to the board. If something happens, it's assigned to a board member to take care of it and report back to the board. Decisions are made by the board. And private companies have boards specifically for that. And so that can be part of it, and to answer like your, Grace, like your trucking company, GE and stuff, they will hire third-party companies to do that. And if something did happen to the product, then that third-party company is the one responsible for it and does the investigation in conjunction with GE. And so they would look into it, and they'd both have their teams look into it. In our field, we have, companies that make things for us. And if something goes wrong with that particular product, we're looking at them and doing our investigation for them, and then they're doing their own internal investigation to provide answers of what happened. So it's an accountability thing, and as long as you hold everybody accountable and in line, then things can work out and you can get to the bottom of stuff. But when you start hiding things and not reporting to the appropriate people, kind of like in NASA, then chaos happens. So.
So this question kind of almost goes back to the Google case study that we did a few weeks ago. But what was their sort of team dynamics like, and was there any level of psychological safety in the teams that they had?
It didn't seem like it. I mean, there was not psychological safety because, like you said, if somebody, made a complaint, then they will lose their job, and I don't think that's I mean what encourages people to report any sort of irregularity that they saw.
Also, there was
Maybe
no
that's how
trust.
Go ahead, Grace.
Also, there was no trust. It didn't seem like they trusted each other because they didn't believe when things were being said, and they were just like brushing it off. So there's no trust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something I noticed was also like in the emails and stuff, in the emails that were mentioned in the case study, it was like kind of some like scathing emails. It felt like they were kind of, yelling at each other, and there was just so much disagreement. And like Grace said, there was just no trust. And so it was like they just couldn't get anything done because everyone was in disagreement and they could never actually come to a consensus and make anything happen. So after everything that we've talked about, what do you guys think are some like main principles to kind of to be applied or to learn from this case, or gospel principles even?
You need to think about more than yourself.
Yeah.
I think in anyone, gospel, in your life with friends, family, I mean, in a whole, if you're just thinking about yourself, then usually people are injured in the way.
I think too, humility. I think some of those top dogs, the top leaders, should have been a little bit more humble and listen to the kind of lower end employees instead of just brushing them off.
Yep.
And when you have a problem like foam falling off your shuttle, fix it.
You have to address it and fix it. Yeah, and also, have that security that you can you know, you can report people for not doing their job, and because at the end of the day, it's not just everybody should be held accountable for anything wrong that goes in any workplace.
Yeah, I think it's all about kind of, I felt like there wasn't a lot of just mutual respect. I'm like, you're an engineer at NASA, like, you've got to be pretty smart. And so you would think that you would listen to your colleagues, but it seems like there was such a level of pride that they just weren't interested. Everyone just felt like, I'm the smartest one here. I know more than you know. And, when everyone thinks that, yeah, you're not going to be able to get anything done. And there was just no respect for one another, even though you're both probably highly educated. They didn't really believe each other.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Does anybody have any last comments that they want to share?
No, I'm good.
NASA stinks.
Yep.
I hope we get to read more uplifting case studies in the future.
Yeah.
Uh,
Sad.
I think we get the problem case studies.
Mm-hmm.
Make me upset.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks everybody. But yeah, we've covered everything. So yeah, thanks for everybody's participation.
no problem.
Just wanna. I was reading ahead, and not lesson 9, but lesson 10. It said that it'd be best if we can meet earlier in the week, because I guess we got to do this thing and we have to meet first before we can finish the assignments. So just a heads up. I don't know who's the leader for lesson 10, but I guess we should look into our calendars and see what day in the beginning of lesson 10 we can meet. So just giving you guys a heads up on that.
Yeah, thanks. That would actually work well for me because I'm going to be out of town on Friday, so I wasn't going to be able to come to the meeting, but I can go if it's earlier in the week.
The only days I can't do it in the morning are Tuesday and Thursday. I can't do before 11. But other than that, I'm open.
No, I'm open any morning. So just let me know which day you guys pick, and I'll make it work.
So you said lesson 10?
Yeah, if you go to lesson 9, like on the very bottom, after the assessment, there's like the folder, and it says,
10.
yeah, there you go, that one.
Okay, so on lesson 10, I guess I'm the team leader.
I was gonna say it's Sorrel or Jerry because I'm week 9.
Yeah.
So is this not next week, but the week after?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go out in time then. I'm almost done. Be patient.
I should be fine anytime, but I'm on the East Coast. I think I'm like the only one on the No, Carlos. Yeah.
Britton, what day did you say wouldn't work? Or what times?
I think she said Tuesday and
Thursday before 11.
Sorry, yeah. I can do anytime after 10 actually.
And what time zone are you in?
I'm in Mountain Time.
Do night times work for anybody or just during the day?
I could meet on.
It depends. Oh, Carlos works.
I could meet on Tuesday, like around after like 4 p.m. my time.
On Tuesdays is gonna be hard for me because there's mutual for my kiddos and I drive them around. But Wednesday and Thursday nights are okay with me too. If that's the only possibility.
Like Wednesday morning? Would Wednesday be too late in the week?
I'm good with Wednesday.
I'm good with Wednesday too.
Me too.
But Wednesday morning, right?
Maybe we could say tentatively Wednesday morning, and then when it gets closer, we can finalize.
Yeah. Well, that's the only reason why I brought it up, because I know, everybody has different schedules, so we can kind of look ahead.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, so if we just say Wednesday at this time, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock your guys' time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that works for me.
On Wednesday the 27th is going to be, right?
Yes.
Sounds good.
So it's the same time. We're keeping the same time, right?
Yeah, same time. We'll just do it
Same
on.
time.
On Wednesday, yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. Great.
Sounds
Thanks, guys.
great.
Thank you.
you.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you. Bye bye.
All right.